Oftentimes, actors or actresses who are playing a character on screen will be given more information about their character than the audience has so that they can play the character accurately for either when that information is fully revealed or if it's never revealed but it's still important to the character. This appears to be the case with the character of Alys Rivers in House of the Dragon, with the actress Gayle Rankin mentioning multiple times in interviews that Alys Rivers may be up to 400 years old. The way that she speaks about it definitely says to me that this is some information that she's been given about this character's backstory that can influence how she plays the character, but we definitely haven't been told that yet on screen, if we're ever going to be. Today, I'd like to explain why I think this is the case using the information that we've been given in world and maybe get to the bottom of what exactly is going on here with Alys Rivers. And this is obviously something that will contain potential spoilers for House of the Dragon, but then again, if I'm wrong, maybe it won't. To be clear, I'm using information that comes from the main book series, not information that I know from the books about the future of House of the Dragon. I'm completely speculating on where they may take this story based on things that were told in the main story. So let's start by taking a look at a couple of the quotes that I mentioned and see where this whole mystery comes from. In one such quote, she says, "She's kind of like the First Lady of Harrenhal if there was a government. She knows all the really wonderful spots to go swimming and do fun, pleasurable things. She spent a lot of time figuring out how to be by herself, but that's like a blessing and a curse after 400 years. She's also said, she's someone who has all of this power, who's been alive for potentially 400 years. How do we make her a person with a beating heart and wants and desires? I hope that's felt inside of our exploration with her." So we can see that it's mentioned multiple times that this character could be up to 400 years old, and I find that really interesting and definitely think this was something that was told to her about the character so that she could play her accurately, because otherwise, why does she keep bringing it up when she's talking about the character? So yeah, Alys Rivers, by some means or another, has had her life extended far beyond the normal lifespan of a human. That is, if she is indeed human. Remember, she says at one point that she's actually a barn owl, cursed to wander the world in human form. Now, when she says that, it's played off as sort of a little joke that she's making, but it might be the case that that's a joke, but it also is actually true. I like to make jokes like that whenever the opportunity presents itself. Like, for example, when this channel was starting to get popular, I mentioned to one of my friends who's read the books, like, hey, I'm thinking about starting to talk about A Song of Ice and Fire on YouTube, put out some of my theories and things like that. Do you think I have any chance of getting popular? And he's like, no way, like 1 in 1,500 chance you're ever going to get popular talking about Game of Thrones at this point. And I was like, yeah, you're probably right. And at that point, I already had several thousand subscribers, and I didn't tell him about the channel for several more months until I could reveal that, yeah, actually, remember when I brought that up? It had already happened, and I found that very funny. So if you assume that potentially me and Alys Rivers have similar senses of humor, at least in that respect, this quote about being a barn owl forced to wander the world in human form could be something that is just directly true, but is taken as a joke because of how unrealistic it sounds at first and how casually she says it. But when you take a deeper look at the main series, you realize that there's a group of people that Alys Rivers could be a part of who fit this description pretty darn perfectly, and that would be the Children of the Forest. This is something that I love to bring up because I think it's one of the things that's the most overlooked by the A Song of Ice and Fire theory community. The fact that the Children of the Forest seem to, at least at some points, disguise themselves as people so that they can blend in with human society. When we first meet Leaf, she says that she wandered the world of men for 200 years to watch and listen and learn. And when they ask her if she has a name, she says, "When I am needing one." So that sort of pretty heavily implies that when she needs to take a fake name, she can do so, and if she's been wandering the world of men for 200 years, well, that probably means that she's been disguised as a person, and she's been using fake names. Now, the reason that I think she would fairly easily be able to disguise herself as a person is because, well, she's got someone living in the cave with her who is a known user of glamours, which is a magical technology that we see put on display in Dance with Dragons, the same book where Leaf says this stuff. And Melisandre tells us that, yeah, you can basically change what you seem to be to anyone who's looking at you who isn't, like, very, very perceptive. She uses this power to transform Mance into Rattleshirt, and no one at the wall seems to notice until she reveals it fully to John by taking the glamour away, and he changes back into Mance right before John's very eyes. And she says something along the lines of the wearer's essence does not change, only their seeming. So what you seem to be and how you appear to others is something that's able to be manipulated by this magic that we know Bloodraven is using, and he's in the cave with the Children of the Forest. So is there some chance he learned this from the Children of the Forest? I think that there's a decent chance the answer to that is yes. Melisandre uses this magic, but we aren't told that it's specifically fire magic. So these other magical beings, like the Children of the Forest, seem like, yeah, they definitely could also have access to this ability. And this is something that I think would be very helpful for a child of the forest who wants to wander the world of men for 200 years to watch and listen and learn. And so, yeah, glamoring yourself as a random woman seems like what Leaf would have probably been doing for those 200 years. It would explain how she could have possibly been walking the world of men for 200 years when we don't have any recent interactions with children of the forest and people that are known about anywhere. It would be something that's completely logical because, again, she's in close proximity to someone who we know uses this magic. And also, it would kind of weirdly explain the story of grumkins in the north, which are part of northern legend. For those of you who don't remember, grumkins are these weird little changelings that are supposedly able to steal children and potentially replace them with an exact copy. So, this is something that could potentially allude to the idea that every once in a while in this world, people are stolen and replaced by an exact copy, which could definitely be what the children of the forest would do if they wanted to pretend to be a person for a while. The Grumkins thing is probably the weakest little connection of this entire theory, but at the same time, I do find it interesting that since book 1, we've been seeded with the idea of these little changelings who could potentially replace children with an exact copy, and then in book 5, we're meeting a child of the forest who claims to have wandered the world of men for 200 years. But now let's get back to that whole 200 years thing because, as we're talking about Alys Rivers potentially being 400 years old, well, if that's about the lifespan of a child of the forest, maybe that's where that number came from. So, to be exact, Leaf tells us that she was born in the time of the dragon, which means after Aegon's conquest, so within the most recent 300 years of the world, and she wandered the world of men for 200 years, so that means for 2/3 of the time that the Targaryens have ruled, Leaf has been wandering around as a person. Which is pretty interesting because when you take a look at some of these shows that are older than Game of Thrones, you should almost expect that Leaf should be there somewhere. It's of course entirely possible that she's someone who's not at all relevant to the story at all, and I don't actually specifically think Alys Rivers is Leaf, although maybe in House of the Dragon canon they'll end up making her Leaf to be sort of a callback to Game of Thrones and sort of a connection in that way. But I do think that, yeah, at the time of House of the Dragon, Leaf was out there wandering the world of men to watch and listen and learn. The math just straight up checks out on that one. So we know that Leaf is less than 300 years old, but more than 200 years old at this point, and that would make a 400-year lifespan check out pretty darn well. So that's one box clearly checked for a potential child of the forest explanation for Alys Rivers being 400 years old, and that comment about being a barn owl forced to wander the world in human form, well, that also kind of checks out if you're a child of the forest who has to disguise yourself as a human. Especially because when we find out about the children of the forest afterlife, it seems that they spend their afterlife and pretty much eternity living inside of birds. Or at the very least, some of them do, and this is something that becomes pretty clear to us in A Dance with Dragons as well, when Bran is learning from Bloodraven how to skin change into ravens. When he finally figures out how to do it and he hops inside of a bird, he quickly realizes as he flies around that he's not alone in there, that there is some woman there. And when he gets back outside the bird into his own body, he asks Bloodraven about this. And he says that that's a woman of the Children of the Forest, long dead. And part of her lingers on, just as part of Bran would linger on inside of Summer if his boy's flesh were to die upon the morrow. Bran asks if all of the birds have children in them, or singers as they're called in the books, so he asks, do all the birds have singers in them? And Bloodraven replies, all. This is obviously a pretty crazy revelation, but I think it only really makes sense if part of the afterlife of the Children of the Forest is going into the weirwoods, which then seems to give you the ability to jump around from bird to bird, sort of like Bran can once he's being trained as a greenseer. That does make some sense because people who are wed to the trees seem to have this ability, and so if you're dead inside the trees, it would on some level make sense you would have this ability as well. And just being stuck inside of a tree and looking out the eyes carved into the trees forever seems a bit boring, but if you can jump around from animal to animal, that's a bit more of an exciting afterlife. Wargs, or those chosen by the old gods, also seem to have some sort of access to this afterlife, as we learn about again through A Dance with Dragons, as we see with Varamir, as we see with these birds in this cave, and as is probably going to be the case with Jon when he dies and goes into Ghost. Returning to Alys Rivers, though, specifically, the point is that, well, if she does know that her afterlife is potentially going to be inside of an animal that she warged, and potentially her favorite bird is a barn owl, Well, maybe she looks at this idea of, like, her being a barn owl cursed to wander the world in human form in the same way that someone who's very religious might say that they are an eternal soul cursed to wander the world as a human until they're able to go back to heaven. Realistically, I think that's a pretty solid explanation for what exactly Alice Rivers means when she says she's a barn owl cursed to wander the world in human form. She's just explaining her religion as a child of the forest, potentially pretending to be a human who is destined to end up eternally as a bird. And since she doesn't really go into full detail about it and no one else there knows about the details of the children of the forest, well, that just comes off as a funny little joke. So when you take all of that into account and add it in with the fact that in House of the Dragon we see her doing some creepy weirwood magic and giving Daemon visions, and she seems to even know the green men from the Isle of Faces because she's not at all surprised when one shows up, well, her being a child of the forest makes more sense to me than her being a normal human. In fact, I would say that if she is a child of the forest using a glamour, everything about her character suddenly becomes entirely consistent with what we were told in the main series of books. Granted, we do also have the situation of Melisandre in the main series of books, where she is probably about a similar age to Alys Rivers, and she's probably not a child of the forest in a glamour. I think it's far more likely that she's hooked up to a glass candle, and I have other videos about that which you can check out on the channel after this one. Also, just for the record, even though we know Melisandre seems to be using a glamour like permanently to alter her form, I don't think Alys Rivers is secretly Melisandre in a different form. I think that she was busy doing other things at this point and only ended up coming to Westeros when she started to see Stannis in her flames. There are multiple ways in this universe that you can end up being several hundred years old, but I think being a child of the forest in a glamour is the one that makes the most sense for Alys Rivers. So I guess let me know what you think about that down in the comments. And make sure to like and subscribe while you're there. The other thing that I'd like to ask your opinion of down in the comments, along with do you believe this, is if this is indeed the case, do you think it'll be revealed to us in future episodes of House of the Dragon? I think that her glamour eventually slipping or her choosing to reveal her true nature to someone later on in the series is something that would go pretty darn hard as a major twist reveal, and also, as I said, would be something that would sort of tie things back into Game of Thrones because Game of Thrones fans would know what the Children of the Forest looked like, and so if she just sort of lets the glamour go and turns into one, that would be a moment that a lot of people would talk about. If House of the Dragon wanted to cut out a lot of the Weirwood magic and go away from it, sort of like Game of Thrones did in the later seasons where they didn't end up revealing any of the cool Weirwood shenanigans, well, I think they would probably not have included the Isle of Faces or the Green Men to the extent that they already have, so it seems that, unlike Game of Thrones, HOTD is leaning into this stuff. So I wouldn't really be surprised at all if by the end of the series this is a reveal that we actually get. But I'd like to know your thoughts on any of that stuff down there in the comments, and in the end cards popping up on your screen right now, you should see links to a couple different videos that YouTube thinks you'll find interesting, as well as a link to a playlist of the unhinged country songs that I've written and recently released. Checking out any of those helps support the channel. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back with something else very soon.